Yo, what's going on, guys? I finally ended up getting around to another pretty much fully fledged build. Um, Ended up doing the numbers, all that good stuff. So this is gonna be what I will be calling the glass hand cannon build. It's gonna revolve around the wildfire. Now I know there's a lot of builds out there surrounding this. I ended up taking a different approach. I ended up taking a more DPS approach to this. So it's going to be slightly different, and I'll explain to you exactly the math of it and the details to the reason why I chose what I did, um, and if I would give you guys better options based on what I have right now. So let's jump straight into it. So first and foremost, obviously the gun you guys are going to be using is the Wildfire. Now the Wildfire is an absolute menace to society. Honest to God, I see it getting nerfed here within the near future, but while it remains, this is going to be your main weapon of choice. Now you have two different options as your secondary that I would recommend. The first one being the Deebringer. Um, this one is going to be really close range. It recently got nerfed, so yeah, you're basically gonna have to see the whites of their eyes to be able to make this work. The other option is going to be the bingo. This one is for more longer range, medium to longer range. More people tend to use the bingo just to keep that distance. It's really personal preference at that point, depending on what you're doing. In my opinion, I would probably say the bingo, but either one works. Now, as it goes for armor, I went with the Renegade set. And now you may be asking, Toxic, why didn't you go for the Savior set? And this is where the math begins. So, if we look at the Savior set, uh, the two main things that really matter are going to be the 2 and the 4 slots. When HP is above 70%, you get 10% more damage, and then after activating an activator, you get 20% damage for 2 seconds. Now, that's not the important stuff. 2 seconds, it's done in 2 seconds. It doesn't, that's basically negated. But what matters on this one is the 20% damage reduction. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, isn't 20% damage reduction really, really, really good? And I'll be like, yeah, sure, that sounds great and all. But if we take a look at the Renegade set, so number one, actually, yeah, number one, we have 10% base weak spot damage. I'm not gonna add this into the calculations, but that's 10% base. The 3 and the 4, even though I only use three Renegade, but it stacks what's called Archer's Focus, which increases weak spot damage up to 40%. So 10 times or plus 40 is going to be 50%. So at max, you're going to be hitting 50% more damage um, for weak spots, that is. And usually you're anywhere between 20 and like 35%. For PvP, for PvE, it's gonna basically always be the 50%, but for PvP, it's usually around 20 to 35%, depending on who you're hitting. Um, this is where the math comes in, and it's sort of like the beret versus gas mask or gas tight helm. The difference is gonna be basically anywhere from like what is it, like 5 to 15%, which in reality will be more like 1 to 5%. So this is sort of more min maxing than anything. But if you're able to get the entire 50%, that's sort of where this shines. But that's the reason why it's the difference between 20 and 35%. So that's the reason why I run the Renegade. And when it comes to the 10% that you get on the Savior, let's see if we can find it. Yeah, the 10% that you get on the Savior, I get that on a one piece Bastille mask, so I'm just gonna run the one piece Bastille mask, and that negates the two piece on this. So we're already what 4 pieces in, and we've already negated basically everything on this, and we still have 2 more pieces to go. Which brings me over to the rest of my pieces. Now I do run a one piece heavy duty for the 10% HP. So this is sort of where I get a little bit more survivability. You can also run a one piece agent to get the headshot damage reduction, which is very, very nice. But believe, if I'm correct, don't mind the view of it. I believe I run, yes, the Huntsman boots on there. I should actually say that's probably pretty important, but you theoretically can if you don't have it for the damage reduction. But yes, that brings us on to our last piece, which is the Huntsman boots, which basically makes this build what it is. After triggering Bullseye, the next one bullets, it's technically not one, it's a lot more than that. Hitting target counts as a weak spot, even if you do not hit the weak spot. And I'll show that to you here in a second. But yeah, no, this is kind of mental. You're basically doing 30% more damage or weak spot damage constantly. So to bring it back, we will run one Huntsman, three Renegade, one Bastille, and one heavy duty. And all of this together, you're gonna number one. Let's show you the savior set. So the two perk is negated by the renegade, and the four perk is negate, or at least the damage reduction is um negated by the weak spot damage increase. The only thing that you will have maybe an issue with someone running a savior piece is going to be the extra health that you get when it automatically pops a activator. But again, activator is like what, anywhere from like 50 to 70% of your HP back, depending on what you use. Um, so at the end of the day, the extra damage that you are doing is basically going to negate it. Um, the only thing, again, I think the only thing that really, like, really is taken into account between the two um, is mainly the HP disparity. I have seen a lot of different builds with HP, but again, it really comes down to one is more defensive and one is more offensive. So it depends really on your play style. But let's jump straight into the mods. So for the mods, I personally run on my Wildfire vulnerability amplifier. Now, this one, I will say this. For me personally, I rather sort of a mix more so towards weak spot. If I could have like 70% of my mods be weak spot, I would, but it's sort of 50-50 right now. And it's been working. And I'll go into the reason why it's been working. But pretty much Bullseye adds vulnerability +8, so that's extra damage that you're doing onto them. Um, Basically, like my shrapnel build, you want to be going for weapon damage. Technically, more so weak spot, but crit damage also works. Um, a reduction or a health or a magazine increase, and then damage to great ones. Um, that's basically what I would go for. Now, on the offhand, you can have vulnerability amplifier, but pair that. I highly recommend you pair that with a hunter's perk, which basically marked enemies. So if you mark someone, say with the bingo, you do that off the first shot, you do that and then you switch over to your wildfire, they're doing 20% less damage to you. It's kind of incredible. So you can pair that with the vulnerability amplifier, just to give you that edge. And again, weapon damage, this had a really high crit, so that's why I kept it. Damage to great ones and then weapon damage reduction, pretty standard. As it goes for armor, this is sort of where it gets a little bit more complicated. For me, I've gone with precise strike. Hitting weak spot grants a weak spot damage +12, so up to 36%. So as long as you're hitting weak spots, which you're going to be doing pretty often, um, this will do a lot for you. And again, substats basically the same: weapon damage, weak spot damage, damage to great ones, anything that's sort of, I guess, I would call a passive defensive or a passive offensive perk. So weapon damage reduction, headshot damage reduction, magazine capacity, health, basically anything for that would be a good 4 perk. For the chest, it's been the same for pretty much all of them. Again, we could go theoretically weak spot, but resist advantage is really, 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 really good. You could obviously go for something like this, a weak spot damage boost. But personally, for me, if you get like a good crit or a good weak spot on here, it sort of negates that because, like, see, this one is like 12%. Say it was 12% weak spot. This one would be 18%. So you're missing out on like 6%, but the damage reduction of 10% at basically all times basically negates that 6%. So that is the reason why I run a gold mod. This is basically just the math of it all. But that's basically why when people are like, oh, you should run this to get more damage, they're completely missing out on the fact that if I get more resistance than I do more damage, then it's more worth it to run the resistance. Anyway, but yeah, onto the pants. Pants are a little bit harder of a one to get because there's not really anything for weak spot. But again, this is where I go crit again. My best in slot, Deadshot, Violent. Thank God I got this so I don't have to run the fridge anymore. But weapon damage, magazine capacity, crit damage, damage to great ones. Plain and simple, just increasing the crit damage. This one I think I would change out for a weak spot. I just haven't gotten around to it, but you would go slow and steady. This is a always guarantee 10% extra damage, and there's always the do I do this or do I do covered advance or whatever the one is where it's if you don't take damage for 4 seconds, you get 20% increase in damage. The reason why I like to run slow and steady more is it's always a guaranteed 10%. Always a guaranteed 10%. For the other ones, it's more like you have a situation. This one, you only get the situation if you're above 90% HP, but like you're always gonna have a 10%. That's the reason why I like it. So that's why I recommend slow and steady over the other one. But again, more preference than anything. They're both 20% at the end of the day. Just if you don't take damage often, I guess I would run the other one. If you like to heal a lot, slow and steady is definitely your way to go. As it goes for the hands, personally, I run weak spot damage boost. If you compare this to anything else, like if we go over to here to the crit amplifier only increases crit damage by 15%. It does increase the crit rate. And again, like I'll get into why crit damage and crit rate is nice, but why I personally go with the weak spot. But for this, weak spot damage plus 25%, that's a huge chunk of weak spot damage. And if you're constantly weak spotting, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. And again, weapon damage, weak spot, all the way through. Now, as it goes for the mask, this one pretty straightforward. Um, there's not really any good mask for a weak spot for bullseye, but what I personally run is when hitting marked targets, crit rate and crit damage plussed up. And this one I got lucky and got 15% crit damage. So it's basically how I go about it. Again, it's sort of like a 50-50 for weak spot, maybe more so towards crit, but um, I would probably go more towards weak spot 70%, but we'll see. We'll see. Anywho, let's jump right into the next topic. So I'm not gonna go too much into the cradle because cradle override always changes, but I will tell you what you should be on the lookout for. Again, anything to do with like the pistol or the sniper, you can run this. It doesn't really matter, just as long as it boosts exactly what you're doing. Bullseye, all that good stuff. Like anything that just boosts it, there's no wrong answer when it comes to the cradle. So long as you're like, if I'm using bullseye, I'm not going to use a frost or burn. I would just specifically use bullseye, and if I'm using a pistol, I'm not going to use an AR or SMG cradle override. So that's what I do, and then also some defensive and just like moderate perks is what I would go for. So it's basically what I would do for the cradle override. I wouldn't think it about it too much. It's constantly changing over the seasons. Just do whatever you think is best, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really affect it all too much. So as it goes for the DPS, I'm not gonna go into too much just because I all the videos that I see are, oh, I'm using this food and I'm using the heavy axe and I'm doing all these different things to proc different damages. But if you're in a normal scenario, you're not going to be doing that. So for anybody wondering why doesn't Toxic ever use the dummy for damage numbers, is because number one, all of them are fucking inflated and all of them are bullshit, and most of the time you're not going to be getting them. Most of the time it's just going to be like a food buff and maybe a drink buff and maybe occasionally one other thing, but you're not going to be in a PvP or scenario where you're just constantly doing that. Maybe for PvE, but again, the time you spend buffing, you could just have killed the boss and moved on to the next thing. So that's genuinely why I don't do it, but I do want to show you this much. I'm gonna go until I get a weak spot. So right there is 12,000. We keep going. Let me actually shoot the head because it'll be better for this. See right there, a weak spot crit. A weak spot crit does a ton of damage. If we do it again, 13, 12, 14. So we'll say around 13. We'll say around 13. But as you can see, the headshot crit will do 20,000. That's the reason why I say it's probably better due to a 50-50 split, because weak spot crits will do an absolute ridiculous amount more compared to a normal headshot. It'll do anywhere from like 30 to 50% more. So if you're wondering why, hey, you're going so much into crit, well, that's the reason why. That's the reason why. But again, I would probably go a little bit more into weak spot if I could. But that's the reason why I do that. But for calibrations, this is just something I'm going to go over quickly. Personally, for myself, I run I think it's precision. Let me just check this. Yeah, precision style. To get the 25% extra damage. Now, you may be wondering why not rapid, yada yada yada. Well, I don't know. I just like doing 25% more damage. The damage numbers look prettier. I don't need the it's basic. I mean, at the end of the day, it's basically the same thing. I'm pretty sure you're getting on the rapid style 25% increased fire rate, but minus 10 damage. This one is 25 damage and minus 10 fire rate or whatever it is. Let me double check this. Yeah. But what's more important is the substats. For me personally, I started running crit rate, precision style. But you can get away with weak spot. I'm pretty sure they do about the exact same damage numbers. If I remember correctly. But for me personally, the more I'm able to crit, the easier it is for me to do those chunky numbers, and that's basically what this build is, the glass hand cannon. So I hope this guide was helpful for anyone and everyone. I did take it a different approach. I know I'm going to get a lot of comments, but why aren't you running Savior Toxic? But again, I've gone over the math of it, and the math doesn't lie. If you've seen anything about the gas tight helm versus the beret, people are like, oh, the beret is better. I mean, if people who have actually done the math out know it's supposed to be 10%, but in reality it's 3 to 4% better for the gas tight helm over the beret, and I think it's going to be the same for this. So it's more a matter of do you want to min max or which one do you prefer doing? But for me personally, I like seeing big damage numbers, big numbers. Give me them good feelings. But again, it's up to preference. You can theoretically run this exact same build with Savior for more survivability, but I think this one does better overall for both PvP and PvE. But let me know in the comments what you guys think. And again, I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, concerns, comments. Doesn't matter. I check them all. I try to reply to them all as much as I can. But again, thank you guys so much. I hope each and every one of you guys has a wonderful, wonderful day. And as always, take care. And I'll talk to you guys later.